Okay, the main event we've all been waiting for. Now, we've all seen those brightly colored yellow and orange Flight for Life helicopters on the news or perched on the top of Boulder Community Hospital. And if you want to get a really good look at them, all you got to do is drive all the way up to the roof of the parking structure and park there and wait. But what's the story behind these things? Kathleen Mayer is a registered nurse and has been the program director for Flight for Life since 1999. Today, Kathleen will speak with us about the history of this remarkable organization. She will also provide us with an insider's perspective on how Flight for Life's helicopters, airplanes, and ambulances transport patients to their 5 operations bases in Colorado, and she will tell us about the special services they provide to Colorado's search and rescue teams. Please welcome Kathleen Mayer to Boulder Rotary Club.
Well, thank you, John. It is really a pleasure to be here. When I got a call from Mike Brady requesting my availability, I will just tell you, he can be a very persuasive man over the phone. There is no question about that. I could talk for a long time about Flight for Life and its many aspects, but the one that I think is probably most appropriate and perhaps the easiest to capture in 20 minutes or so is its history. And I want to start by saying really Flight for Life is very closely tied to Colorado's history and has been for the last almost 50 years. The program went in service in October of 1972, and it was the first civilian-based helicopter program in the U.S. and has been the launching pad for more than 300 other similar programs in the country. The program that John referred to on the roof of Boulder Community is actually not Flight for Life. It's called North Colorado Medevac, but that was certainly patterned after Flight for Life, and some of our crew members have gone on to play a key role in that program. So closely aligned, and we do refer flights to them and they to us when we're busy. Let's see, these were the very first nurses for Flight for Life. They were recruited from the ranks of the emergency department and the pulmonary division at St. Anthony Hospital. The gentleman in the suit in the middle of that august group is Dr. Boyd Bigelow, who was the pulmonologist who actually recruited those nurses and taught them, flew with them, used to carry a big brick of a Motorola 450 radio, if some of you know what those are, so that he could be continuously in contact with the nurses when they were out if they had a question or something. We tend to be a little bit egocentric at Flight for Life, and we think that this program must have been the crowning accomplishment of Dr. Bigelow's life. And clearly, to the day he died about 4 years ago, he was very, very proud of it, but it was a means to an end for him. Dr. Bigelow's real commitment and his true love was rural health care. And Flight for Life was a way to deliver emergency care and in its later iterations, intensive care to parts of Colorado that otherwise did not have access. And we're going to talk about some of those going forward. Some of these nurses went on to do really incredible things. A couple of them went to medical school. One went into the astronaut training program with NASA. One went into law enforcement. They were really a very accomplished group. Their early years were not easy. They were pushed out of the back of ambulances and told to go back to the hospital where they belonged, that nurses had no business being out on the street, out in the helicopter. You may be wondering about those white uniforms. Well, at the time, the nuns, the good sisters, were still very much a presence and a factor at St. Anthony Central. They had 3 floors in the center of the hospital for their convent. And they were of the notion that those nurses should be wearing their caps and their white dresses and their white hose on that helicopter. These white pantsuits were a compromise, and they lasted about 2 weeks. And you can imagine how people looked coming back from the mud and the muck and whatever else wearing those. So after a couple weeks, the nurses were allowed to design their own flight suits, and they went with the more practical navy blue. They also designed the equipment they carried, how they carried it, determined the drugs they were going to carry, wrote the clinical protocols. There was no guidebook. There was no roadmap. There was no flight nurse academy. These guys, and we owe them a huge debt. We really stand on their shoulders today because they did very, very hard work in an era when what they were doing was unheard of. The reason the helicopter says Olympic Wing and Rotor on it is that it was designed and dedicated to serving the 1976 Olympics, which, as you know, never came here. But the pilot and owner of this helicopter was a kind of entrepreneurial soul who set up his business to shuttle visitors from Stapleton Airport up to the respective venues for those Olympics, which were going to be very widespread, all the way from Howelson Hill up by Steamboat for the jumping to Monarch Pass for some of the alpine events. So it was going to be a huge expanse to cover. He found himself with nothing to do when the Olympics were awarded to Innsbruck, Austria, after Denver turned them down. So he came to St. Anthony, landed on the roof. No one knew he was coming. Took the elevator down to the CEO's suite, said, "I understand you might be looking for a helicopter," at which the CEO promptly called the FAA and turned him in. But they did carve out a relationship for a couple of years. So, yeah, it was peaceable after all that subsided. 1976 was Flight for Life's first participation in a mass casualty incident. This was the Vail Gondola accident, which happened in March of that year when 2 gondola cars transversed a section of the cable just distal to a lift tower where that cable had frayed and broken, and those 2 cars dropped to the ground beneath them. They were both fully loaded with people. There were a total of 4 fatalities in that event, but many, many people injured. At the time, Vail had a little landing strip for an airplane right next to I-70. It was called a STOL port, S-T-O-L, for short takeoff and landing strip. And they allowed our airplane to come in and help move patients back to Denver along with the helicopters we had at the time. That was really our first major casualty event. The next one was something that I'm sure some of you who live in this area and have maybe been in northern Colorado for a while remember very well, Big Thompson Canyon flood. This happened on the night of July 31st, which was the state's centennial. August 1st was the state centennial. It was the night before. There were many people out camping, enjoying the mountains. A thunderstorm stalled over northern Colorado near Estes Park and dumped 18 inches of rain in about 4 hours. Created a tremendous wall of water that came careening down the relatively narrow Big Thompson Canyon with no warning. Killed 144 people, including a Colorado State Patrol officer and an Estes Park police officer who were helping to direct traffic around a bridge that had been washed out. In this event, Flight for Life flew 19 hours straight. This was before duty time regulations and things like that came into play. They had a rescue diver tied by a rope to the helicopter skid, and they flew up and down the canyon rescuing people from the riverbanks or from trees or houses and roofs where they had been stranded. And this was not great weather. It wasn't like it quit raining and cleared off and we had blue skies. It was still very rainy, very cloudy. And our helicopter was one of 19 in that canyon. All the rest were National Guard or military. But over those 19 hours, they evacuated 85 people to Estes Park from the site. Some of them were injured, some of them were just very cold and wet and tired. Next mass casualty event, it wasn't really mass casualty, but it was an event that wrought havoc with the Denver metro area at least, was the Christmas Eve blizzard of 1982, in which 48 inches of snow were deposited in metro Denver, and rural areas like Parker and Franktown and Elizabeth were virtually cut off from civilization. We flew 148 patients in 24 hours, back to back to back. And many of those patients weren't critical, but they needed to get to a hospital. Many of them were women in labor who had no way to get to the hospital to deliver their babies. And the pilots who flew back then tell the story of landing in a cul-de-sac or a park or something, somewhere as close to the residence or business as they could get. And the flight nurse would go into the home or wherever to meet the patient and get them stabilized and ready to go. And while the nurse was in doing that, other neighbors would come out of their houses and approach the pilot, fishing their wallet out of their back pocket and saying, "Can you go get me some beer? Can you go get me some disposable diapers? It won't take you very long." They could have made a fortune if they'd been to the delivery business back then. This was the next major MCI. This was the Teller lift accident at Keystone, which happened in March during spring break. You can see the round wheel that's sitting kind of at an angle there. That's the bull wheel. It's supposed to be horizontal and turning, pulling the cable to which the chairs were attached on the chairlift. This was a new lift, unlike Vail, which was a fault in an aging lift and a parts failure. This was a new lift. It had only been in place for about 4 months at the time, and this bull wheel fractured off of its pedestal. When that happened, it sent a shock wave down the cable that initially dropped the chairlifts or the chairs, and then they were catapulted back up, and skiers fell from that lift to the slopes below. We flew about 40 patients from this accident back to Denver in our old Alouette helicopters. We could take 2 patients on those. There was only 1 fatality in that incident, which was incredibly fortunate. But another very busy time for us. Skip forward several years, April of '99. We'll never forget being in the cafeteria at St. Anthony Central, having some lunch, and one of our flight nurses came down and said, "You know, I was just up in the communications center and heard some radio traffic of shots fired at Columbine High School." And we knew right then that this was going to be a very serious event. We did stage a helicopter near the high school. We did not fly patients directly from there, but we did move patients out of Littleton and other hospitals close to that venue when they were overwhelmed with the injured. Busy day for many people who I'm sure will never forget that. And fast forward to another unforgettable day, 9/11. As all aircraft in the country, we were grounded immediately after the towers were hit. We could resume flying that afternoon only with a phone call to air traffic control, telling them where we were going and getting their approval to launch. Early that afternoon on the 11th, we got a call from Bonfils Blood Center at Lowry. Bonfils had been requested to send blood back to Manhattan, and they were one of the few blood centers in the country that could actually process the blood that had been donated so that it was ready to go and be distributed to hospitals that needed it. So they were approached, they agreed to prepare 300 units, and we were asked if we could possibly get an airplane into the air to get it back to Manhattan. Once it became known that we were able to do that, we got a call from the Cunningham Fire Department in Denver asking if we could also take 4 urban search and rescue people from FEMA back to that site. We went to Bonfils about 1 o'clock in the morning on the 12th. One of our ambulances and the EMT and I went, loaded the blood, and proceeded to Centennial Airport on the south edge of Denver and loaded the blood into a Hawker Siddeley jet that was part of Mayo Aviation's fleet at the time. And the 4 FEMA people boarded. The airport was eerily quiet, eerily dark, just the ramp lights at Mayo were on and the runway lights. And I watched that airplane taxi out, climb into the night sky. I'm sorry, I can't get through this story without getting a little teary. And watched it head off to the northeast. As that airplane moved east, they were handed off to Minneapolis Center from Denver Center. And the pilots told us that when they came up on the radio, Minneapolis Center, this is 643 Charlie Romeo. We are with you at 43,000 feet, requesting clearance directly into Teterboro, which is an airport in New Jersey right across the river from New York City. The response from Minneapolis Center was 643, you are cleared direct. Teterboro, we are aware of your mission. Godspeed. Unfortunately, most of the blood that we transported wasn't needed. As you probably remember, there were many, many walking wounded, minor injuries from 9/11, and nearly 3,000 fatalities, but there weren't too many people hospitalized who needed the blood. We were actually met at Teterboro by a half-track tank from the New York National Guard and a fully armored helicopter. Such was the level of security back there. They took the blood, and our pilots flew home on that very lonely morning. Last one, more recent one, a very sad day in Flight for Life's history. This was the crash of our helicopter on July 3rd of 2015 on the helipad at Frisco in a parking lot nearby. We lost our pilot, Patrick Mahaney, and 2 flight nurses were critically injured, both of whom have survived. I put this up here. It's kind of a sad moment for us, but to tell you what's come out of this. We worked with Representatives Perlmutter and future Governor Jarrett Polis to have some legislation passed with the full support of the NTSB to improve the occupant safety of helicopters. And the first step in that was mandating the installation of crash-resistant fuel systems on all newly manufactured helicopters. The obvious loophole there is that the helicopters that are existing were not mandated to make those improvements. We instantly, well, relatively instantly, as soon as we could, made those changes to all of our helicopters and put the crash-resistant fuel systems in. And now every new helicopter coming off the line has to have them, which will hopefully limit the post-crash fires that have killed so many people, unfortunately. This is our program today. We have 5 helicopters, one based in Lakewood, Durango, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, and Frisco, which is the highest air medical base in the country. We have 3 airplanes, a Learjet 45 and 2 King Airs based in Denver and in Durango, and then we have several ground ambulances based around the state that do transport of our less critically ill patients or critically ill patients who just don't need the speed of the helicopter. Last year, we completed 6,000 transports among all those vehicles. We do work extensively with search and rescue, as John had mentioned, doing backcountry rescues. We have a program working with search and rescue in situations of avalanche, getting patients out of those areas quickly, and we will transport a search dog and dog handler into those areas to help find a victim. The dogs are some of our best behaved people or critters ever on that helicopter. They're very calm, and anybody who gets to do a dog flight is always quite happy that they had a good day. So that's essentially the formal part of my presentation, but I am happy to entertain questions. Go ahead.
Just how do you recover your costs on this?
Well, from your lips to God's ears, we do recover our costs. Sometimes we don't, but we do bill insurance companies, and because we're part of Centura Health, which has a very extensive network with insurers, most of our patients are in network with whatever their insurance company is. We also write off about $15 million every year in uncompensated care, including the write-offs for Medicare and Medicaid. We will never send a patient to collections or put a lien on their house or some of the more unsavory practices that you're hearing about. But our reimbursement's actually very good. 93% of our patients receive no bill from us at all. Yes. Here.
I want to thank President John and responder Mike, because I'm not the responder, for a moment of personal privilege here. I was going to thank John for letting me get in first, but he didn't. I'm going to see if I can get through this. March the 19th, 2004, my wife and I received the phone call that you never want to receive as a parent from the Boulder Sheriff's Department with very little information, but basically saying your daughter has been in an accident and she's on the Flight for Life helicopter heading for St. Anthony's. Call down to St. Anthony's to get more information. The accident, it turned out, they didn't know at the time. It was on Highway 93. She'd been heading south around midnight. No drugs or alcohol in her system at all. She was 18 years old. She was doing about 50 miles an hour, somewhere between 50 and 55. Car hit her head on. The police estimated doing 120. Her car was pushed back 50 feet. We learned that later. Anyway, we went down to St. Anthony's, and she lived through the flight, and she lived was taken in there, had a lot of surgery, and today she is a nuclear physicist working in Los Alamos. She has 2 wonderful children, and last year she completed 2 half Ironman events, and it's all thanks to Flight for Life. Thank you.
Thank you.
That should have been the conclusion, but I do have a little question, and we're so glad that, thanks for sharing this Jenny's story. It's wonderful how well that turned out. My question is, what are your guidelines? We've heard a lot about the safety of civilian service helicopters this last week. What are your guidelines about flying in bad weather, and what kind of equipment do you have? Do you have the equipment that warns of approaching terrain, that sort of thing? What kind of safety equipment?
Thank you. Yeah, we have FAA minimums that we do not violate. We have to have a certain ceiling, and we have to have visibility for a certain distance, and it varies from day to night and from local environment to long distance or farther out environment. We are absolutely strict about abiding by those. The final decision to go is always the pilots and the pilots alone. However, any one of the crew members, we call it a unanimous cockpit, we require a unanimous cockpit, any one of those medical crew members, and it's a nurse and paramedic typically can say, I'm not comfortable, we're not going. And there is no second guessing, no questions asked. The helicopter is equipped with the TAWS system, the Terrain Awareness Warning System. It's also equipped with air-to-air deconfliction programs that allow us to know where other aircraft are, not drones, unfortunately, but other aircraft, and radar altimeters, and our helicopters are chosen for their altitude capabilities. Our particular model summited Everest many years ago, and even though the manufacturer says the ceiling's 22,000, we know it can exceed 29. So they're very safe from that respect. They're actually overpowered for our environment here, but in the summer, on a warm day with a bigger patient coming off the summit of Long's Peak, we need every bit of that power. So we don't fly instrument flight rules in the helicopters. Those are where you have to rely on instruments to fly, because typically in Colorado, those conditions are also icing conditions, and helicopters do not do well in icing. So we're visual flight rules only, but we pay attention to those instruments, absolutely. Yeah. Other questions? I think one in the back, maybe? I'm sorry, is there an average?
When you take off, do you know what the average or minimum cost is of the flight?
You know, it's a really hard number to get to because the charges are based on the miles flown. and which vehicle we're in. The helicopters have one set of charges, the airplane has another. So the liftoff fee, I believe, is, I'd have to look at our material, but I think it's somewhere around $15,000. But again, 93% of our patients don't receive any kind of bill for that, so. Anything else? Yeah.
What is the patient capacity of the helicopter?
Capacity is 1. Because we have the 5 helicopters and 4 of them are along the Front Range, if we need to transport more than 1 patient, we will call for a second ship, or we'll call one of our other neighboring programs like North Colorado Medevac here in Boulder, or Air Life is also in the metro area. Yes.
How many flights can you do at one time, and how many do you have available
Well, we
at
could
any one time?
conceivably have 5 helicopters and 3 airplanes in the air at one time. And that's happened, was last week one day. We had everything we owned flying, so, yeah, yes.
You said that you write off approximately $15 million each year? Oh, you must have significant private funding, or?
We do, and that 15 million, let me be clear, that includes all contractual allowances for insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, that's everything, and a lot of self-pay or uninsured patients. We have wonderful support from the St. Anthony Health Foundation and from our other base foundations at Penrose and St. Mary Corwin, Summit, Durango. That funds all of our capital equipment. It funds the salary of our flight chaplain, and it also funds all of our education expense, and it's just been our lifeblood, truly. Yeah. Anything else? There's one? Okay.
From the time you get called, how long does it take typically to deploy or get an aircraft into the air?
We expect our helicopters to be airborne within 10 minutes of the call. Typically, they're off more quickly than that, but if the pilot needs to do any flight planning or check weather along the route, then we make an allowance for that. So the airplane's expected to be airborne within 45 minutes of a call, and the ground ambulances are supposed to be rolling within 10 minutes of the call. Yes?
If you have pilots that are just sitting because there's no call, how long can they sit before they have to rotate off and are then no longer available to fly? And how does that influence how you staff?
Our pilots are bound by the FAA regs that mandate a duty day of no longer than 14 hours. They work 12-hour shifts. They've got that 2-hour buffer at the end if they should be out on a flight and maybe the patient's sicker than expected or whatever. But all of our crew members work 12-hour shifts. We are just too busy to work 24-hour shifts, which a lot of the air medical industry has gone to. So typically the nurse and the paramedic and the pilot are all starting and ending their shifts about the same time.
Quick,
Is there a common incident, like the most common incident that you respond to? Is there a typical type of incident that I should be aware of that you usually respond to?
Sure, the question was, is there a typical kind of patient that we usually respond to or kind of incident? I think primarily today our patients are either injured, cardiac, or stroke. Cardiac and stroke are time-sensitive diagnoses. Those patients need to get to definitive treatment quickly. We also do a lot of pediatric flights, high-risk OB complications. Yeah, it's kind of all over the map, but if we had to pull out the top 3, those would be them. Yeah.
Just a quick question about staffing. We think of ambulances as being staffed with paramedics, but you guys use both nurses and paramedics, and I'm curious, 1, why, and 2, whether there's specialized training that they undergo for providing services in the helicopter.
Sure. We fly with a nurse paramedic team because in the state of Colorado, to be licensed as an air ambulance, you have to have a nurse on board. And we find it's a really good combination. Our nurses come mostly from intensive care unit backgrounds. Our paramedics mostly from busy 911 ambulances. So they have a very good knowledge of the the street and seeing medicine and safety in the highway and all those kinds of things, whereas our nurses walk into the ICU and see that sick patient on the ventilator with many drugs infusing and all, and they are right at home. So it's a good mix in that way. They kind of complement one another. Our orientation is 14 weeks long, and that's intense didactics and precepted flying with a senior nurse. And then for the first year, the crew members are on a kind of probation where they are still closely monitored and have extra help anytime they need it, so.
I have a quick question. How does the dispatch work with several different services available in the metro area? Who gets the call and how is that decided?
It's really decided by the agency or the entity calling. Typically, in the metro area, it's whoever's closest to that patient. Now, in the backcountry, we may be called even if there's a closer helicopter because of our altitude capabilities and our pilots' capabilities in the mountains. And that's an area of specialty that we really don't have an equal to. But in terms of the patients moving from a hospital to a higher level of care, the inter-facility transfers, that's determined by the sending physician. If he or she has a preference or has worked with a particular agency, then typically that's who they'll call.
I'm just curious about crossover with the military and the extent to which you either derive pilots from the military or how much training you do with the military based on their aerovac capability.
Yeah, most of our pilots come from the military. It's excellent training ground for helicopter operations. We still have a couple who actually flew in Vietnam, but most of them are Gulf War veterans. It's hard to replicate military training. We have a couple that have come through the civilian ranks. We have a very close relationship with the Colorado National Guard, and especially when a patient is in such an inaccessible area that they have to be hoisted out, the long line rescue, what we will do is set up a nearby landing zone with the Guard helicopter. It's typically a Black Hawk or a Lakota, and do a nose-to-nose landing, and they will transfer the patient to our care right there because they typically don't have medical personnel on those ships, so, yeah.
Just curious about some of the costs. So if you had to order and replace, first, what's the life of your current helicopters? And if you had to replace it, what are we talking about in cost?
Okay. Our helicopters, and we're just in the process of replacing them now, they're about 20 years old, between 17 and 20 years old. Now, very few of those parts are original. They've been replaced over time. But helicopters hold their value very, very well, and all of the ones we're replacing are still airworthy, but the technology has improved so much. The avionics, and they all now have autopilots and things that weren't available 20 years ago. So that's as much a driving force to replace them as their actual age. If we were to buy one of our helicopters, medically configured, so ready to go, would be between $3.5 and $4 million. We don't buy them, we lease them from a company called Air Methods, which is in Englewood, and they provide us with our helicopter pilots, the actual machines, and all the maintenance. Anything else?
Kathleen, I just want to thank you on behalf of Boulder Rotary. Came down here, you gave us an inspiring and proud history. Doc, thank you for sharing your personal story, the impact that you're having. It's kind of hard to put words into. You're saving lives, and so thank you for coming here today.
Thanks very much.
Rotary is also proud of also saving lives. Since 1985, our signature program has been eliminating polio from the face of the earth. 350,000 cases in 1985. Today, we're 99.99% there, and we're very close. And in your honor, Boulder Rotary will donate 100 doses of the polio vaccine to our program. Thank you very much, Kathleen.
Thank you.